So it's really important to use the correct worm for vermicomposting. Most people think a worm, oh yeah, I know what a worm is. You know, they're all alike, but they're not. There are over 9,000 species of earthworms, and they range in size from ½ an inch to 12 feet long. And so, huge difference. So you don't want to just grab any worm and put it into a worm bin and expect, you know, that it's going to do what you want, you know, eat organic material. And so, very simply, we must understand earthworms in general, okay? And so the scientists have divided the 9,000 species into 3 different groups according to where they live and what they eat. And so, first of all, the Anecic earthworms, they're the big fat night crawlers that we're familiar with. They make vertical burrows in the soil. And so they're eating the soil and minerals in the soil. And then sometimes they come up at night out of their burrows and they'll grab some leaf litter and take it back down into their burrows to consume. So those are the Anecic earthworms. And then you have the Endogeic earthworms, and they always live underground. So they make horizontal burrows, and they're just consuming soil. So again, living in soil, eating soil, that's what we assume earthworms do. So there's a third type of earthworm, and it's epigeic. And it does not live in the soil or eat the soil. Totally different, but it's still an earthworm. So it lives on top of the earth, on top of the soil, in leaf litter, in animal manure. You know, if you've ever seen cow dung or horse manure or something and you see worms in it, those would be the epigeic worms. Also, if you're you know, at the bottom of a leaf pile or under a log, someplace where it's dark and moist and things are rotting, that's where you'll find the epigeic earthworms. And they are the ones that you use for vermicomposting. And 7 species out of the 9,000 species, 7 were identified that are suitable for vermicomposting. But there's really one species that most people like to use worldwide. And those are Eisenia fetida is the scientific name, okay? And it's important to use scientific names because otherwise we have common names, you know, depending on where we live. Even where I live in the state of North Carolina, some people might call it a red wiggler, others will call it a tiger worm, others will call it a brandling worm or a red worm. There are just all sorts of common names. And then people think they're talking about different species of earthworms, and they're not. It's only, you know, Eisenia fetida. And I find it interesting as I've traveled about the world, people think they want a California redworm. There's no such thing. They want Eisenia fetida, but people have come to believe that there's a special hybrid worm out of California that's really good. And so, you know, that's all a myth. I mean, you know, they're not going to, they mate within their own species. So we talked about Eisenia fetida, that's really kind of the ideal earthworm to use for vermicomposting. If in tropical countries, of course, you know, they can use something local that is a tropical species, but otherwise, I found that most people worldwide really prefer using Eisenia fetida because it adapts to a wider range of environmental conditions. Because you're taking this earthworm and you're putting it inside a bin and you're expecting it to stay in the bin and do what you want it to do to break down the organic materials. And the And so again, they tolerate kind of a wider temperature range, wider pH range in the food that you give them. And also, they're less temperamental. So think about animals and think about pets, you know, like some dogs are really mellow and some are, you know, really agitated. And you think about any animal that you've dealt with, you know, horses, other, you know, you can tell they have different temperaments. Individuals do. And so Eisenia fetida just has a better temperament than most earthworms. So, so they're going to be content if you provide the right environment for them. They're going to be content to stay there, because there are things that can upset earthworms. You know, you're taking them out of a different situation, putting them into a new situation, and they can kind of, you know, freak out that, wait a minute, now all of a sudden I'm in different bedding and I'm receiving different food, and, you know, just different environmental circumstances can get them upset and want them to flee. And just a change in barometric pressure, say if there's a storm coming, then they sense that and they want to leave. Or if it's raining really hard, they want to go out into they want to follow the wetness, and that's why earthworms come out of the ground when it rains. It's not because people think it's because of they're concerned about drowning, but it has nothing. They don't drown. Usually that doesn't happen. So they're coming up. It's an opportunity for them to find a new home, find a new mate, find different food sources, because it's wet. They have to be moist in order to breathe. So starting out with a small worm bin, you know, to practice vermicomposting, something that's in the range of 10 to 18 gallons, okay? So something that's, you know, maybe 18 to 24 inches long and only about 18 inches deep or less. Vermicomposting needs to be a shallow process. It's very important that it's less than 2 feet deep, okay? Because if it's greater than 2 feet deep, materials can heat up and the worms can die. So we call it cold composting and shallow composting. So unfortunately, that means you need, you know, if you want to expand, you're going to need a large horizontal space. You cannot make a bigger vermicomposting operation by making it taller. So important to keep in mind, always keep it below 24 inches. All right? And generally we start with, well, in a small bin, like the one I just described, you would fill it about halfway full of some type of bedding. So worms have to live in bedding. So say if you bought a plastic tote with a lid, that's not the environment for worms. You know, they do not have lungs. They breathe through their skin. Their skin has to stay moist. So you don't just put them into a plastic bin or a wood bin and say, there you go, you're on your own. No, they need bedding, you know, just like we do. They need a comfortable space that they can, I don't know, just exist in this organic environment. So when people do small worm bins, you know, to start with, a lot of people will use shredded paper. And so, you know, when I started doing this 30 years ago and teaching it, people read newspapers. They don't so much anymore, but you know, office paper, newspaper, any of that works. But that's dry, right? And so when it gets shredded, it needs to go into a bucket of clean water for 10 minutes so the paper fibers can absorb the liquid, and then, you know, so it's nice and wet, and so you squeeze it out, and so then it's, you know, kind of in a ball, and so you pull it apart as you put it into the worm bin, and you're going to fill it halfway full with that. You could use compost, like a really well finished compost, as a bedding. Some people use aged horse manure. Something that will not heat up is really important, okay? Some people do use coconut coir. Coconuts don't grow here in Europe. They don't grow in the United States, so I think the carbon footprint is too great to use coconut coir, but some people will use that. Some people use peat. That's kind of an old-fashioned way of vermicomposting. And peat, again, environmentally, not a good idea. But also, peat is acidic. And so then people have to balance out by putting calcium, mixing calcium in with the, you know, to lower the, to raise the pH. And so it's not a good way to do it. So, like I said, just starting out, use paper in a small bin like that. And so you really need to start with 1,000 earthworms. So 1,000 of these red wigglers, and you're never going to find that. I mean, even if it rains and you see a bunch of worms, it's like there aren't 1,000 of them, and you don't know what species they are. So it's really important to buy the earthworms from a worm grower. And so 1,000 is roughly a pound. Sorry, I don't know kilos, but anyway, so roughly it's a pound of worms. And, you know, if you have less than 1,000 when you're starting out, people always tend to overfeed. They think, oh, I'm going to put this food in here and tomorrow it's going to be disappeared, you know. The worms are going to eat it as quickly as my dog eats its food. And it's not true. So it takes longer than people expect. And so it's really important to have 1,000 earthworms instead of maybe 100 or 50, because it's just going to take a long time for the food to break down. Okay. In a small bin that you're starting out with, you're going to be feeding your kitchen waste, right? So vegetables, some fruits, you know, things that you chop up that you're not going to consume, you would feed to the worms, all right? But food waste can attract flying insects, you know, like fruit flies and house flies, and you don't want those flying insects around your worm bin. That's no fun for anyone, especially if you've decided to have a coffee table worm bin. You don't want your guests swatting at flies, right? Well, very simply, if you cover the food, insects will not know that there's any food inside this bin. And so, so that's the beauty of the paper, is that you would pull back the paper in a spot and add some feedstock for the worms, and then you cover it. So, and you cover it thoroughly, okay? This, you can be very laid back about vermicomposting, but be OCD about covering the food waste. Because if you can't see it, then insects won't know it's there. So, perfect solution. So harvesting the vermicompost, so say you have a small household bin, there are different ways of harvesting it. So first, some people like to, we call this the light separation method, because earthworms, they don't have eyes, but they have sensors that they sense light and they don't like light. And so if you put a plastic sheet or a tarp or something, either outside on a bright sunny day or indoors under direct light, then you empty your worm bin. And so what's on the bottom, which will always be earthworm castings, which is, you know, the worm poop, that will now be on top, okay? So you've just dumped the contents of your worm bin onto this sheet, and now your worm bin is empty, right? And so you're going to prepare more bedding. So if you'll remember, you fill it halfway with moist bedding, okay? And so go ahead and do that. So, you know, the light is on this pile, and the earthworms are moving down under the, you know, to the bottom of the pile to get away from the light. So you've set up your worm bin, you know, with fresh bedding, and you have a separate container labeled black gold, and that's where you will put the vermicompost that you harvest. And so you just take some and put it in there. If you find any earthworms, they will go back into the bin, into the fresh bedding. If you find any old bedding that was in the worm bin, that goes back into the worm bin too, because it's just full of microorganisms. So when I harvest a bin that way, it takes me 60 to 90 minutes, all right? If you have children, it's a really fun thing. They will want to participate in that, you know? So another way, we call it horizontal harvesting. And so this bin that you've been using the bin for 4 to 6 months, and the earthworm castings have been ending up on the bottom of the bin, and it finally gets to the point where you say, I think it's time to start harvesting. And so at that point, you visually divide the bin in half. So visually, not physically. And so you start only feeding on one side of the bin. And you keep that side moist. You let this other side, you don't add food to it. You let it dry out more. And the worms will go to the other side of the bin to follow the food and the moisture. And that will take a few weeks. Because again, it's not like your pet dog. Oh, the food's over here. It's you know, they're just more chill about it. There's still some bedding over here. They will re-eat their castings. And so some are fine to just hang out on that side of the bin. But within a few weeks, most of them will be on that side. And then it's easy to remove the vermicompost from the other side. And it should be pretty free of earthworms. And so, and then you put fresh bedding on that side and start only feeding on that side, and then the worms will move back over, okay? So that's horizontal harvesting. And then there's vertical harvesting. And with that, you have different trays. Or if you got a plastic tote bin, you could put, you would buy 2 tote bins, okay? And make sure there are lots of holes that you drill into the bottom. And then as things build up in your worm bin, when it gets to the point where you could put this other tote bin on top of it, and it will rest on the bedding, then you start only feeding in that upper bin. And there are some special worm bins you can buy commercially on the market that are stacking bins like that. And that's the whole intention. You start vermicomposting in just one chamber, and then as it fills up and there's room for another tray or another tote, then you start only feeding in that upper chamber, and the worms move up through the holes and vacate the lower. So again, it takes, you know, a few weeks for that to happen, but then it's easy for you to remove the vermicompost from that lower chamber. So those are the 3 ways of doing it. Okay, so I want to talk about leachate versus vermicompost tea. They are 2 different things. It's really important to understand that. There's a lot of confusion worldwide about it, because if you mismanage your worm bin and you end up with too much liquid, it will come out the bottom, okay? Some people say, oh, it's worm tea. It's great. I'll use it on my plants. Well, because it has passed through this organic material, it is full of nutrients, and you will notice if you use it on plants, you know, if you water your plants, you'll notice increased growth, okay? It's a natural thing. Just like if you took cow manure and put it in a muslin bag and put it in water, you know, you've added nutrients to that water, and so there's going to be an effect from the plant growth. But many of us know that that cow manure could have pathogens in it. Well, your worm bin could have pathogens in it too. And you might say, oh, you know, I'm only putting, you know, just, you know, vegetable waste from my kitchen. But there are pathogen outbreaks. So you might have purchased spinach last week, and then some of it went bad, and so you put it into your worm bin last week. And then this week, it's in the headlines that that spinach was contaminated with E. coli. So it's like, great, now you have E. coli in your bin. And so then this liquid is going through the E. coli and coming out the other end. You don't want to use that liquid. It could have, I call it the stinky mystery liquid, okay? Because it usually does stink because it's passed through anaerobic areas of your bin. So it's this dark, stinky liquid. And the mystery is you don't really know what's in it. There could be E. coli and salmonella or other pathogens. There could be salts and acids and things that, you know, that are not beneficial for plants and that you definitely would not want to put on a prized plant or a plant you're going to eat. And so, so that's leachate. And first of all, you should not have excess liquid coming out of your worm bin. You need to manage it so that you don't. And that usually happens because of overfeeding. Again, people think, oh, the worms will eat this right up, and they won't. You know, they're more laid back eaters. And so don't use leachate. You're taking a chance with it. But what you can do is intentionally make vermicompost tea. So what you do is, again, the castings accumulate on the bottom of your worm bin, and when you harvest them, then you can very carefully brew them. And there are a couple of ways to do that. There's aerated and non-aerated. The non-aerated takes several days. A lot of people will aerate, and it can be as simple as you know, in a clean bucket with clean water. You put, you know, a bag with vermicompost in it, and it steeps in the water. With the aerated, you have a bubbler. So even like if you had a fish aquarium, that type of bubbler can work. You can buy a compost tea brewer, you know, that's manufactured. But that, you're using the finished vermicompost that's high quality, and then you're being very careful that you're again using clean equipment with clean water, and you're making this beautiful vermicompost tea that can be used as a soil drench, you know, where you just pour it on the soil, or you can spray it on plants. And so, you know, people are doing that on a really large scale, you know, on farms and greenhouses and, you know, where plants are used. But you want to be careful about it. So So cleaning the equipment after every time you brew is really important. And it's important if you're using this activated, aerated tea process, you're going to do it for 24 to 48 hours. And then you should use it immediately. You should use it within 4 hours because it's been actively brewing and it helps increase the number of microorganisms. And then when it stops, the microorganisms will start to die off. And so it's really important to use it right away. I'm Rhonda Sherman, and I've been at North Carolina State University for just short of 30 years. And I was hired because recycling had just been mandated in the state, and everyone was saying, what do we do? You know, how do we recycle? And so I was hired to educate people and answer questions. And so I'm not only talking households, but businesses and then the trash managers. So landfill managers, government officials, everybody was wondering what's happening with recycling. And so I was hired for that. And, you know, of course, it's expected to publish. And so I right away wrote several publications about recycling, but I also decided to write something about vermicomposting. So I titled it, Worms Can Recycle Your Garbage. And it flew off the shelves. It had to keep being reprinted because there was just such a clamor to learn more about vermicomposting. And it just spread beyond, you know, I served the people of North Carolina, but I started hearing from people in other states and then other countries. And now I've heard from people in 121 countries. They have contacted me specifically about vermicomposting to learn more.